Hello, everybody. Welcome to the MEV panel. I'm excited to be moderating this. MEV is something we think a lot about at Osmosis. Osmosis, before it actually became a DEX, we were actually working on like MEV mitigation strategies, and we're like, well, we need a product here, and that's how we built the DEX. So maybe we can just start with some introductions, though, from you guys. Barry, you want to go first?
Sure. Hi, guys. My name is Barry. I'm the co-founder of Skip, which is a Cosmos native MEV infrastructure team. We're working to basically build toolkits to help chains capture MEV, design block space markets in the way they want them to be run, and distribute that revenue to their stakeholders in the way they think it should be done.
Hello. I'm Raps. I'm the co-founder of Mecca Tech, and we work on Interchain block space markets.
Cool. Maybe we can start with asking you guys, for anyone who doesn't know, what is MEV? And it's also I feel we've pretty well memed MEV as a word in Cosmos to be this very scary thing, and our team may have had a role in that. Why is that should MEV be a scary term? Is there good MEV? Or is all MEV bad?
No, I think so. The scary word in MEV is extraction. So it somehow conveys the idea that there is value in an ecosystem, in a community, which is being taken out and going elsewhere. And sometimes that could be sort of represented in some kind of rent being extracted by a party that has a privileged position. It could also be represented by the lack of competition in a network, or it could be represented as additional infrastructure or operational costs, which is burdened to a validator or to a player to perform some otherwise essential role in a community.
Yeah. To back up a little bit and try to do what is MEV, I think a lot of people have different definitions, and most of them I really don't like. The one that I use, which is probably wrong as well, is there's a black box, basically, that takes place between when a user signs a transaction and how that transaction ends up in a block with other transactions and how they're ordered. And MEV is sort of like the output of how we design that box. And different designs, whether you sort of just have transactions first come, first serve, whether you have some kind of auction system, whether you do something else, something on chain, you can end up with different people making money off of that. And in some cases, that money can be sort of kept in protocol or in a community. In other cases, it can kind of leak out. And so for Skip, we think about sort of good versus bad MEV in the context of extraction. And we really do see sort of a strong difference there, and I think that's something that makes us different than most other MEV infrastructure providers. I think front-running and sandwiching harms user experience on DEXs, and basically every DEX I've talked to is doing things to try to mitigate that. And so our view is user experience should sort of be the guiding principle that we follow, and we should try to enable kinds of MEV that don't harm user experience, and we should try to do things to disable kinds that do.
Which user?
Retail traders, the folks who bring liquidity, liquidity providers, folks who are actually using the DEX, who are holding the token.
But how do you square that circle? Is it if you sandwich a trade on a DEX, right? That constitutes a payment from a user to an LP. So the question is, in a community, are LPs represented? Are there incentives aligned? And how do you find that overlapping preference?
It's a good question, actually. It constitutes, I think, part of a payment to an LP, but then there is a significant portion, the profit of that sandwich, that often exits the chain and ends up getting paid to the sandwicher. And our view, again, is MEV is something where I don't think there's a right answer, right? I don't think there's a wrong answer. It's a question of values. And we have to make sort of value-based decisions here about how we weigh LP incentives against traders' incentives, against the incentives of market makers and sophisticated traders.
What are some so kind of related to that, I feel if you, in Ethereum we've noticed something very interesting, which is the whole MEV game has actually brought so much like mind share to Ethereum, right? Like I know so many like builders who started as searchers and then got bored of that or got competed out of that, and then they're like, oh, well, I guess we know this stack very well. We're gonna start building stuff on top of it instead now.
Exactly. Like the whole MEV game can just be like a builder incentivization program to sort of bring people into the ecosystem and get them paid completely independently. So no grant, no job, no employment, no permanent establishment risk, just like on-chain activity that gets you into the ecosystem and creating value. And I think like to come back to what Barry's saying about like good and bad MEV, like we are very much not in that game of making that declaration at Mecca Tech, right? We know from the research that as soon as we look into the effects of even what is considered the most dubious kind of MEV, like sandwich attack, right? It does have aggregated benefits in terms of beneficial routing, so not just in terms of incentivization. So it is this sort of like weird space of overlapping of preferences, and one of which is like who can participate in creating that liquidity and getting that value. So bringing developers to the ecosystem, is it a tax on users? Yes. Is it worth it? I'm going to go ahead and say yes. I think that the actual, I would say that the usual price that a user pays, say 2% slippage or whatever on Osmosis, right, is like, it's barely worth talking about, the 2% slippage. I know on Uniswap or whatever, there's huge things, but the 2% or whatever to bring devs into the ecosystem is such like a clear win. Actually, it might be the most effective allocation of capital, like better than a grants program that could be quite political, right? It's like a governance minimized on-ramp for developers. That sounds amazing to me.
I think viewing MEV as a way to get developers into the ecosystem is a pretty narrow way to look at it. I think it's one way developers can come into an ecosystem, but I think over the past few months and few years, Cosmos has not had a hard time getting smart developers into the ecosystem, and that's without creating any kind of social shelling point around the need to sandwich people or front run people or those kinds of things. Like, there are other interesting things to build, and when you don't allow those kinds of strategies, there are also other kinds of strategies that are more technically interesting. But putting that aside for a second, I would also say Skip is not really in the business of making this distinction. We're a product-driven company. This has come from dozens of conversations with validators and dozens of conversations with chains, including Sunny, where people have said to us, okay, yeah, we like MEV. We want to try to help our stakers make more money. We want to try to help token holders make more money, but our users are afraid of this kind of stuff, and they're afraid of having their money taken, even if it improves optimal routing. And I think trying to fight that trend is something we don't want to do right now, but ultimately something we would also be open to leaving up to governance. At the end of the day, like, it's not really our choice, and we don't think it should be either.
Yeah, I feel in Cosmos, we've going back to the previous point, instead of these searchers, I feel like there's a really good validator to developer pipeline. I feel like so many projects, like, they start by running validators and then they learn the stack and then they start to build stuff. So I don't know, maybe we already have a pipeline for that a little bit.
Exactly, and I think the issue is that if you're a bottom 100 validator, so if you're like number 100 or 120 or whatever on Osmosis, right, you're making probably about like 40 Osmo a month or something like this, and whatever price that is, that's just not enough to even do things like participate in governance. Sometimes we think about validators and their economics purely in terms of like running servers, which is ridiculous. Like, validators have an essential role in the political economy of Cosmos, and if they're making 40 Osmo, how can we expect sort of people to put in the time necessary to participate in that system effectively?
So, Sean, you guys, Mecca Tech started as a searcher. In fact, would that be fair to say? And then you've pivoted towards building infrastructure now?
Mecca Tech has always worked on all sides of the market. On the supply side, as in like selling block space. On the demand side, as in buying that block space and learning about that market and building empathy from that perspective. And then on the market intermediary, right, that mediates these forces, creates competition, and maximizes value for the ecosystem. So Mecca Tech encircles all those concerns.
Can you guys maybe compare and contrast, like, how does Skip and Mecca Tech differ in how they approach MEV in Cosmos in general, and then maybe also on Osmosis specifically?
Well, I think like Mecca Tech is like a very much builder-oriented organization, so we just like went ahead and built it. So we have a market that's live, running with validators on Osmosis today. You can go to Mecca.tech and you could read the documentation, you could integrate. We're probably going to have around 10 to 15 validators. As soon as like this conference nonsense is done and people get back in front of laptops, I think you're going to see a lot more voting power go through our system. We also operate searchers that essentially generalize back running to actually incentivize real validators with real revenue. And then we take a cut of the profit, which we use to just redelegate to the validators that help us. So we kind of like make some money and then we lend that back out to the community so that all their profits are sort of incentive aligned with the overall growth of the ecosystem. So that's what Mecca Tech is doing. I won't speak for Skip.
Yeah, I think we've taken a very different approach with respect to Osmosis, as well as sort of the block space market that you guys have created in general. So your solution is very similar to out-of-protocol PBS in Ethereum. We actually believe that Cosmos needs a Cosmos native solution. There's a lot that you can do with Tendermint and the Cosmos SDK and ABCI++ that isn't captured by that solution. And so over the past few months, we've been talking to Sunny, talking to validators in Osmosis, and have developed a module that will be launching on-chain that will capture back-running MEV revenue for the Osmosis community in a way that is fully audited, fully visible, and can be reviewed by everyone, and allows the community to decide, okay, where do we actually want this money to go? How much of it should go to Skip for providing the services, and how much of it should go to LPs, or the folks actually being back-run, or stakeholders and token holders. So I think this sort of does capture the main difference between us, which is we're trying to actually go out and figure out what do people need, and then look at Cosmos and say, okay, what are the solutions we can build here that you couldn't build in Ethereum?
Yeah, just to summarize, I think the biggest difference between Skip and Mecca Tech is like, we did not go through governance. We did not wait. We did not ask for permission. We just built it. And we're relying on the free market to maximize that value. So no governments, we don't know the price. Like our searchers that do back running participate in an open API that could get front run, that could get outbid. Actually, we hope they do get outbid. If someone outbids our searcher, that means that more value is going to the validator, right? So that's a free market sort of approach to this problem. Government's minimized.
So it would be fair to say, like, the distinction is Skip is taking a very on-chain approach, while Mekatek is taking a more off-chain approach?
Well, I think, oh yeah, so I think what Barry said made a lot of sense, that I think we do need some like Cosmos native facilities. So like right now, the actual implementation is like we just forked Tendermint. So everyone that, the two founders of Mecca Tech used to work on Tendermint, so we know the code base very well. So we just kind of made a minimal patch to enable PBS, right? But it's kind of a pain to maintain. So what we're going to do is we're going to upstream those changes in a native builder module that will provide sort of an open API that anyone can compete with us or anyone else, right, to choose the most profitable block from an open network. And that will be a native module. So one, Mecca Tech won't need to maintain it. I like that. And two, it'll provide sort of like competition all the way at the edge of the validator, you know, and minimize that integration.
It's a good point. So Skip is also working on upstreaming Tendermint changes. We're working with you guys, with Marco, with the SDK team, to try to figure out, okay, what is the best in protocol way to do this in the long term. In the short term, for other chains, so outside of Osmosis, we're working with Evmos, Juno, Terra, a couple others that are not yet announced, that have more generalized chains where maybe in-chain, in-protocol arbitrage capture doesn't make the most sense. And there, we also have a custom version of Tendermint. Ours is quite different. So it doesn't actually just import out-of-protocol PBS and force validators to sign blocks sight unseen. What it does is it relies on completely native P2P gossiping mechanisms that are already in Tendermint, doesn't require validators to make any new security assumptions, doesn't require them to sort of change their key signing, and is sort of easier to integrate as a first step, but as a downside potentially, or maybe as an upside, is less expressive. So we don't build a whole block. We just run an auction to help build a few transactions at the top of the block, and then we let the validator build the rest of it. And that way, even if folks don't trust us, we can't do anything related to censoring or anything malicious. And we can ship bundles that are small enough to show people, hey, we're not sandwiching or front-running your users, and build that trust.
So yeah, with Skip, you guys are like making the explicit like requirement that you can't, like people can't use it for like front running or like sandwiching. How do you do that?
So it has to do with the kinds of bundles that we allow. So in theory, you could still probabilistically try to front run someone using the public mempool, and we don't deal with that. But when you're submitting bundles to our infrastructure, we basically ensure that the person who's submitting the bundle has signed all of the transactions in that bundle after the first one they didn't sign. So you can only put your transactions after other folks' transactions in our bundles.
Sean, you mentioned that you guys have about like 10 to 15 validators on Osmosis running this. Is the list of validators right now public? And is it important for like validators to be transparent about
I think they should absolutely be transparent, and they should be governed by their delegators, right? So I think the system is completely opt-in, and the idea is that we are not going to be the only builder. So our philosophy is that the best thing that is going to aggregate the most amount of value is going to be a competitive market. So we cannot be the only builder. There must be other builders that operate with different theses, like in the same way that like BlockX Route has a builder in Ethereum. It has like an ethical builder that sometimes wins blocks. And this, of course, ensures that no one builder can sort of censor the entire network. As long as there's choice, we don't really have to worry about censorship at that level. And I think that validators will sort of, the goal, right, is not only to maximize the revenue for large validators, but it's specifically to equalize the revenue for small validators, right? So if you have a big validator who sort of vertically integrates, like if we move MEV to the consensus layer, where it's like about doing it right, then big validators are going to have a disproportionate advantage. Small validators are not going to do this. And the thing about most Cosmos networks, and including Osmos, is that like big validators have a tendency to vote less. Like they vote more conservatively. They represent sort of a larger delegation of people and can be less, let's say, engaged in taking the risks necessary to move the ecosystem forward. So we're trying to fix this by making sure that every validator can sort of opt into sort of proportionate amounts of revenue without sort of taking this risk for censorship, and I think we've done this.
I think Skip has completely the same point of view that you need a competitive market for these kinds of things. I think on the flip, in the case of Osmosis, I think you end up with a more expressive kind of protocol value capture when you put it in chain. If generally, like, my personal point of view, and it's not really speaking for Skip, is like, if something can be in protocol, like if it's technically feasible to put it in protocol, it probably should be, so that it's treated just the same as anything else, and it's not some sidecar thing that's attached and is some potential cartelization risk, which is why I think upstreaming a builder module in partnership with you guys will be exciting. But I think it's also why we're experimenting with this on-chain approach first with Osmosis, because Sunny and the team have been sort of so open to that experimentation. And we'll see how it goes, right? We're going to see how governance actually wants this money to be distributed. I suspect it won't be that large validators end up with more of it, and actually, because it's in protocol, you could have a system where folks decide, actually the smaller validators who are getting less revenue regardless should take a larger portion of this revenue so that we can equalize some of that. And that can be voted on in chain.
But the thing about doing anything in protocol is not the question of like what's in protocol, it's a question is what is out of protocol. So if you have, what we're talking about is like designing a mechanism, whether it's like a skip mechanism for the block space or a Mecca Tech mechanism for the block space. The question is not how much is extracted, the question is how much is aggregated, how much of the total value is actually captured by the mechanism. So if we say like, oh, let's put like, I don't know, a searching algorithm in every validator, and it could only do 2 swaps or 2 skips or 2 levels or whatever because you just have a limited amount of space or like low specialization, that means that there's going to be money outside of protocol that anyone can capture, right? So if the solution space is like valued at like how much of it is captured by the validators, it is somehow a superset of what is in the protocol and out of protocol that matters.
So I guess related to this, how do both of your solutions change once threshold decryption is like live, right? And you know we have like most user transactions are encrypted in the mempool. What happens to that value? Does that value like get given back to users, or do you think Like, yeah, how do your systems?
I think either way, most of the value is going to, in a competitive market, no matter what the mechanism is, the core of it is how competitive it is. That means that how much sovereignty, how much agency does the validator have to make a choice over what it proposes? And how many things does it have to choose from? Insofar as it is a competitive market, you're naturally going to see the margins of searchers get squeezed by that competition. And that's the kind of outcome that we're looking for, no matter what encryption or whatever is on the other side of that.
Yeah, so I think for us, it's a lot simpler. Once we have threshold encryption, actually what Skip is doing now, which is backrunning every transaction in the chain on behalf of the Osmosis protocol and giving that money back to Osmosis users, is going to be easier because we don't have to worry about searchers capturing backrunning opportunities from unconfirmed transactions in the mempool. We can actually just run a convex optimizer in-chain at the start of every block and find the global clearing prices for assets on Osmosis, which I think is pretty cool, and then give all that money back to stakeholders. And in terms of competition, I don't actually think that this is in conflict with competition in any way, because you can pair this system with an in-protocol auction system, and then as much as it can be in protocol, you can also control where the revenue of that auction goes, which is another cool thing. So you can have in-protocol competition as long as you can have it sealed bid, and if we have threshold encryption, I think we can really get there. So I'd push back on the notion that putting things in protocol is anti-competitive, and I'd suggest more that it's more about having control and visibility into where the proceeds from the competition go.
But here's exactly how it's anti-competitive. If I'm a searcher and I run a GPU, I'm going to find more opportunities faster than you. Okay? If I do it off-chain, I just need to run it on one node, specialized for exactly that purpose. If we move that in protocol, it means that every validator essentially becomes Solana.
You can still bid in protocol. You can just submit your transaction in protocol and try it. And if we just decide with Osmosis and with the community that we want to put that above our convex optimizer, great, let's do that.
But you backrun everything, but who are you open to being front run, is my question.
So
yes, if that's what the Osmosis community wants. Again, we don't care so much about the details and more about the alignment.
So I would say that the backrun ARBs are, that, from my opinion, how I see it is, because this is all using information that is completely on the Osmosis chain, I feel that is like something that the chain can do. And I don't think that it's not going to be the perfect ARB, right? We don't want to spend too much compute cycles on that, right? But if we can capture 50, 80% of it, and then let off-chain searchers capture the rest, right? So I think these things are in conjunction. I think the real place where the auction really comes in is when you have things related to off-chain information, like if you're arbing prices against a centralized exchange, right? There's no way the Osmosis chain can know the right ARBs to do, right? And that's where that comes in.
But I guess I don't understand why a searcher who could front run the system would leave anything left. So if you're on the tail end, so you get the bottom of the block, something else gets the top of the block, what's the incentive for leaving anything at all?
So I think maybe it's a question of whether you view it as there is a fixed amount of opportunity or not. And I think sort of just looking at how traditional finance has evolved over time, since that's my background for better or worse, what you see is people exploiting information asymmetry advantages at very high frequencies and lower frequencies. And to Sunny's point, I think part of what searchers are going to be doing is looking at opportunities that fundamentally the protocol can't capture, right? Sex-dex arbitrage is something that we couldn't do in protocol, or if we did, it would be extremely dangerous and we wouldn't want to do that. Or things related to trying to do cross-domain MEV, where perhaps there's an opportunity that arises on Kujira and Osmosis, and you need block space on both. Again, we couldn't do that. So I do think it's sort of these ideas work in conjunction, and I think it is very good that we have different approaches going about it so far, and I think in the end you're going to have some combination, right?
I think they can be good. I'm just worried that putting more burden on validators to do stuff that doesn't generate value creates negative utility for the ecosystem.
Let's want to switch to another topic, which is the Atom 2.0 white paper included this idea of a interchain scheduler, they called it. It's effectively a block space futures market. What are your guys' thoughts on, do you think chains are actually going to use it? And two, how does this futures market approach differ to like more the just-in-time block space markets that both of you guys are building?
So we're super excited about this. I mean, we've been going around banging a drum saying MEV is the best way to have financial sustainability and token value appreciation. And now to see Ethan and the folks at the Hub get up on this stage and say, we think MEV is the best way for the Hub to actually get Atom's value to go up is great for us. I think there's questions. I think we agree at a high level, like this is a good economic direction for the Hub to go in. I have questions, around how it will work in terms of how do you resolve multi-dimensional auctions for different block space? Like how do you express those kinds of preferences? Do you build the whole block, or are we auctioning off sort of parts of blocks, and how does that all work? And also, how much DeFi activity will there be on the Hub versus not on the Hub? But we're excited to sort of try to work to answer those questions with Zaki and the team actually building this and try to contribute there. And then on the high, low latency block space auctions, I think you need both, right? The low latency things are useful sort of the block ahead when an opportunity exists. And fundamentally, part of that is going to have to be on-chain if you want, or off-chain if you want to have a generalizable solution. But that doesn't mean you can't also sell block space a long time in advance at some average price and have these systems interact. So I sort of see it as complementary.
Yeah, I kind of agree with what Barry is saying. It's like, I guess Mecca Tech takes a very value maximizing approach, right? So we look at everything incredibly critically. So it's not just this thing that we're criticizing, but just this thing in particular, right? So the way that you maximize value to a validator is by lowering the risk, or as a searcher, you're only going to bid sort of your risk-adjusted returns. That's the value of getting something executed. And there's a lot of things that sort of introduce risk, like time introduces risk. Adding randomness introduces risk, where I have to spam a chain to get executed or whatever. All those things, in some ways, they may seem like they prevent extraction, but they actually create more extraction because it's more wasted effort for everyone, right? So this idea of selling block space in the future, it means that there's so what am I going to bid on that block space? I'm gonna bid at the point of minimal information, some pretty much irrelevant price, some bottom of the basement price. And then the question is if someone, how long do I hold that future? Is it fungible? Can I sell it later? Because if not, if it's locked in by the system, so if the ecosystem converges on this mechanism of which block space is sold once a day, it means the clearing price for that block space is going to be terrible, right? And that means, again, that more searchers are going to go off-chain. They're going to circumvent this mechanism, and then what is the value that's going to be accrued or aggregated to the stakers at that point? So I think the mechanism has a little while to go before it's sort of incentive compatible with where we see the ecosystem going.
Yeah, that's sort of the area I think we'll play a part in terms of figuring out what's a fair clearing price and potentially competing there, and then sort of aggregating demand for searchers, where we'll in real time sell block space back to them, sort of cut up in a way that's off-chain but still drives value on-chain. So I think you're completely right. It's incentive incompatible right now, and I sort of hope that what Skip and Mecca Tech are about is making it incentive compatible.
I mean, I'll buy it for cheap.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll buy it for cheap. But then we're a centralized party. We've been in the market for 9 months now, and it seems counterintuitive. But what we want is more people entering. We want the capital requirement for participating in the network to be as low as possible. That's what's going to maximize value. And so, even though it benefits us, I don't think it benefits the kind of world we want to see.
Yeah, I guess one last question would be will chains opt into using something like the Atom 2.0 scheduler versus Osmosis is building it into the Osmosis protocol? Wouldn't all chains want to build it into their own protocols?
But what is this thing about all chains? I mean, until Flashbots, we really believed that like no one would ever run custom software. That every validator would like pull from GitHub and you know, and just participate, which I think had a stronger argument in Ethereum, right, where miners didn't really play the central role that validators do in Cosmos, right? Cosmos validators are sort of like the bastion of voting. Like they play an important role. So they have a lot of agency and also a lot of responsibility, you know? And so this idea that it's going to be one size fits all for every, like the protocol is going to act as a unified force, especially when we start introducing, you know, ideas like mesh security, you know, where there's multiple participating, multiple networks, like validators are going to do what validators are going to do to perform their role, which is vote on governance.
I think the question is sort of like, does it make sense for Osmosis or another chain that has a lot of DeFi activity to sell its block space on a market that other chains are also selling their block space on? And I think
basically, is there going to be one market for block space across multiple Cosmos chains at the same time, or is it going to be many parallel auctions running at the same time? And if you want to win, you have to like bid correctly on both of the parallel auctions at the same time.
So I think like probably, so there's two pieces to this. One, like if you can, probably like the intersection of block space is more valuable than like the unions of it. So if you get overlapping block space, you're probably willing to, for two chains, for example, you're probably willing to pay more than 2 times as much for that. And then there's also this question of like, well, if I'm a chain, then that's probably more revenue for me and that's good. But what token is that auction settling in, and how do we decide? Like if you guys want your auctions priced in Osmo and Juno wants theirs priced in Juno, like how do we make a good user experience for participating in this auction? And then like, if we did have every chain running their own auction, how could we make a good user experience for like figuring out what to bid and participating in all of those auctions simultaneously? And I don't have the answer to that question yet, so I think you're going to see a lot of folks play with different models there.
And also just like how revenue gets split, right? Like block space on Osmosis is probably way more valuable than a block space on a non-DeFi chain.
How dare you? How dare you? Bias. No, like Mecca Tech will have serialized execution across zones next year. We'll be live, sort of single block space on Juno and Evmos and blah, 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 by the end of the year, and then we'll figure out the combinatorial auction bits and do that next year. It's tricky, but it's not impossible. It'll happen sooner. It'll happen sooner than you think, and I think it needs to prevent validator centralization.
Cool. I think we are out of time, but I have so many questions left. But thank you guys for joining us.
Yeah,
Thank you.
It's been fun.